to speak in front of 100 political students, political science students, and asked him, is there a trick, an advice that you could offer for me and share with me? And he looked up from his desk and he said, no. And then I was about to leave the room, and then he looked up again and said, if you're not really prepared, wear a tie. And yeah, I noticed that you are wearing a tie today, but I guess you are fairly well prepared. So when I received an email from Dionne asking me to say a few words here as part of a welcome, my secretary, who runs my life, she said, no, you cannot do it. You have too many meetings. We cannot cancel this or that. But for once, I overruled her. Otherwise, her wish is my command. But I overruled her, and I overruled her for several reasons. One is that it would provide me with an opportunity to get out of the office just for some minutes and to listen to some distinguished speakers that I'm so happy with us here today, and to just attend this seminar, even if it's only for a few minutes. So thank you very much for inviting me and giving me an excuse for getting out of the rector's office. The second reason is that I was really so impressed with the program when Dionne sent it to me that I really had to come and comment and applaud and thank you guys for setting up this program. I know that you, Dionne, has been very involved in this, that the Center for American Studies has played a huge role. But I also learned today that students was very much part of setting this up. So thank you so much for doing this. I think it's important for the university. So I'd also like to thank the American Embassy for generously funding this event. We're really happy about the strong relationship to the embassy and the collaboration we have. Thank you so much. The final reason that I overruled my secretary is that I am a strong believer in the West. And the West not as a physical entity, but the West as an idea that encapsulate culture, identity, political ideas. Really, the West has its rules, as I see it, in the Enlightenment, and therefore I think the West is important to me, and it's important to us. Even though the West is not a physical entity, the West is based on two major pillars, Europe and North America, particularly the United States. So therefore, what goes on in the US is really important to the West and is really important to us. So that's the third reason why I, for once, overruled my secretary. So just finish up here and thank you all for setting this up, organizing it, funding it, and to all of you to be part of it and also getting involved in this. Thank you so much.
Can you all hear me? Okay. To present our first speaker, one of our graduate students, Maria Denise, would like to present David Woolner.
EJ Dionne.
David Woolner starting.
Okay. Can I just have these? I'm sorry. I was told it was EJ Dionne. Sorry. I'm sorry. Hello. My name is Maria. I'm a master's student here in American Studies. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor David Woolner. For those of you not familiar with his work, Professor Woolner is one of the world's leading experts in Franklin D. Roosevelt. Can you not hear me? Okay. And he brings a wealth of knowledge and insight to 20th century American history. David is a professor of history at Marist College, a senior fellow and resident historian at the Roosevelt Institute, and also a senior fellow at Bard College's Center for Civic Engagement. And of course, David Woolner is almost a local who knows the halls here at SDU because he is also a former Danish Fulbright Distinguished Scholar in American Studies here at the university. Something truly fascinating about David's work is how it bridges the past and the present, which has brought him all over the world, and why he's often featured in media, helping us connect historical events to contemporary issues. But beyond all his achievements, which are many, more than I can list here, and probably more than I can even pronounce, what I've heard from people working with David is that he's not only brilliant, but also a generous and kind person, deeply committed to sharing what he knows and creating dialogue. Maybe that is why he's so well connected and had met all of the US presidents in recent history, I've been told, minus maybe one, someone who's running again, but the name escapes me. Anyway, we are very lucky to have David here today, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy what he has to share with us. Please welcome Professor David B. Woolner.
Great. You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
You might be able to hear yourself a little bit on the screen, but
Okay, I will ignore the screen. Well, thank you, Maria, for that wonderful introduction. It's very kind of you. It's a great pleasure to be back. I also want to thank the United States Embassy in Copenhagen, Southern Danish University, the Danish Institute for Advanced Studies, and of course, Jørgen Brodal, Niels Bajer Poulsen, Sabine Ansberg, sorry for not pronouncing the names properly, and all my colleagues at the Center for American Studies. It is a really great pleasure to be back, to return to SDU and to Denmark. After having spent such a rewarding year as the Fulbright Scholar in 2023-24, and it's great to see Sophia here from the Danish Office of Fulbright as well. My congratulations to Michelle Navakas, the current Fulbright Scholar. I'm sure she's going to enjoy spending her year here as much as I did. And like me, I bet she won't want to go back when it's over. Okay, so we are here today to discuss the politicized or polarized state of American politics in this critical election year. A year that we sometimes refer to an election that seems to have brought about what we call a crisis in democracy. A crisis in democracy that has become ever more apparent, not only in the United States, but also here in Europe and other parts of the world. As a historian, I'm often struck by the parallels between the past and the present. And in many respects, we are living in an era that mirrors the 1930s and 1940s, a period in which liberal capitalist democracy was under siege in practically every corner of the planet, thanks to the onset of the Great Depression and the subsequent rise of fascist dictatorships in places like Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, as many of you know, Franklin Roosevelt took office, and I think this is going to work if I just hit the arrow button. Yes. In the midst of the Great Depression. And this, of course, represents the worst economic crisis in our nation's history. Just to give you some examples, when Roosevelt entered office in 1933, the gross domestic product in the United States was down to about 70% of its 1929 levels. The volume of stock transactions on the New York Stock Exchange had declined by more than 90%. And unemployment stood at 25% nationwide. But in places like Detroit and Chicago, it was running as high as 40 or 50%. Things were so bad, in fact, that the mayor of Chicago sent a message to the White House saying, if you don't send relief, send troops. And there was real talk about the possibility of a revolution in the United States. The other thing we have to keep in mind, of course, is that Roosevelt also had to face the crisis of the Second World War. So today we're going to talk about both the Great Depression and World War II and Roosevelt's leadership through both and how that affected the decades that followed. So what might we learn from this experience. There certainly are lessons we can derive from this turbulent era, not only about the root causes of the populist movements that gave rise to the anti-democratic regimes that emerged in Europe and Asia in the 1930s, but also about how a leader like Franklin Roosevelt was able to overcome these anti-democratic forces, and in the process, strengthen the American people's faith in their institutions and in the democratic process. You'll notice that I use the phrase populist movements when I'm referring to Nazism and fascism, and I think that's really important to think about. You know, if you think about Nazism, it really isn't an ideology, it really isn't a political party, it's a movement. And the same thing with fascism. Movements, by the way, that garnered both of which garnered a great deal of popular support at the time. Having thought about that, we should also remember, as my esteemed colleague E.J. Dionne has pointed out, that there are different forms of populism. Authoritarian populism, which is dangerous and a threat to democracy, and other forms of populism, like the civil rights movement in the United States, that can contribute to democracy's well-being. What's more, we also need to recognize that populist support for authoritarian regimes did not simply appear out of nowhere. As E.J. has written, quote, "Angry dissidence doesn't arise by accident. It is typically a response to genuine failures and injustices. Hence, the best way to combat populist success is to deal with the discontents to which they give voice." Now, considering the rise of right-wing populism in the United States and much of the rest of the world, and the onset of the brutal war that Russia launched in Ukraine in February 2022, the juxtaposition of the two rival political ideologies of democracy and autocracy certainly have relevance for today. Indeed, the unprecedented assault on the US Capitol that took place on January 6, 2021, followed by the Russian invasion of Ukraine roughly a year later, have made it all too clear that Western democracy and adherence to the rule of law is undergoing a test unlike any we have seen since the onset of the Second World War. So we might ask ourselves, how was it that FDR was able to inspire a more benevolent form of populism than that which took place in Germany, say, or Italy, for example, under roughly the same conditions? To put it another way, how was he able to restore the American people's faith in democratic government at the very moment when democracy was under siege, not only in the United States, but at home, where demagogues like Charles Lindbergh, Huey Long, or Father Charles Coughlin, the famous radio priest, provided the American people with a steady diet of fear, fear of the other, fear of the unknown, fear that led millions to embrace what FDR sometimes called the ideology of hate, fear that led to the most destructive war and unspeakable crimes in human history. Here's a slide of the three individuals I was talking about. Well, as you may well know, FDR responded to this sentiment by urging the American people not to embrace fear, but to banish it. This effort began within minutes of his taking the oath of office, when in his first inaugural address, he expressed his confidence that despite the dire conditions in which the American people found themselves, this great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive, and will prosper, and would prosper. As such, he then uttered perhaps the most famous line of any presidential inaugural. "So let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." Now, if I were Franklin Roosevelt and giving this speech today, you wouldn't be in the room. The Secret Service would come in and they would bolt this podium to the floor. And then President Roosevelt would wheel himself in on his wheelchair or be wheeled in by an aide. And then he would pull himself up, lock his steel braces into place. And if you ever look at Roosevelt speaking, you'll notice his left hand is always gripping something very firmly. And then he would go on with his speech. We good? Oh, we're having problems here.
Do we need to change slides?
Yeah. Can you get it to properly? Oh, that's the way I should go? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. So here you see the reality of Roosevelt's life. This man could not get out of bed in the morning without the assistance of others. And, you know, I often think you're talking about a paralyzed man who's trying to lift a paralyzed nation from its knees. Well, the line that got the most applause in his first inaugural was not the only thing we have to fear itself, but this nation is calling for action and action now. And action, of course, is certainly what they got. And you can see from this cartoon, which is typical of FDR, you notice he's running, dragging Congress behind him. And the caption is, looks like new leadership is really going to lead. And then down there, the sign that says emergency legislation. And this, of course, is the launch of what we call his first 100 days.
Sorry, David, keep talking.
Okay. In which Roosevelt passed more than 16, with Congress, by the way, that's important to point out, with the Congress, more than 16 major pieces of legislation in the first 3 months of office. No president has ever come anywhere close to that kind of record. And furthermore, many of the laws that were passed during the 100 days are with us still. Laws like, now my slides won't move. Is this, close that box, is that the idea? Some of you may know this from your excellent history classes here in American Studies. The Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial from investment banking in the United States and set up the very famous Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to guarantee bank deposits. Our first Green Jobs Program, the CCC, which was very, very popular. Major works programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority. And of course, my favorite, the Beer and Wine Revenue Act, in which Roosevelt said, after all this frantic activity, I think it's time for a beer. He actually lifted the prohibition restrictions for 6 months early so that people could at least have beer and wine before prohibition was formally lifted in December of 1933. And there's a list on the left of all the pieces of legislation. This, of course, marks the beginning of what we call the New Deal, which some of you may be very familiar with. The New Deal represents the series of programs that he put together in the 30s to combat the Great Depression, which had an enormous impact on American life. And one of the things that I should mention, and this is very important, a couple of things to keep in mind, is that when Roosevelt took office, there really wasn't, there wasn't a state, as you think of a state in Europe or certainly in Denmark. The only real contact the American people had with the federal government before Roosevelt and the New Deal was when they went to the post office to buy a stamp. There really was very little intervention on the part of the federal government in the day-to-day activity, certainly economic activity of the American people. So the New Deal is going to fundamentally alter that situation, as we'll see. And it includes laws like the Social Security Act, which provided old age pensions and unemployment insurance, major labor legislation, which guaranteed workers the right to form unions and, of course, established the minimum wage in the United States, and massive public works programs like the Works Progress Administration, which employed over 8.5 million people between 1933 and 1935 and 1943, and built hundreds of thousands of miles of highway, 122,000 bridges, and so forth and so on, a huge effort. Now, the New Deal also had a major impact on race in the United States through its employment of African Americans in the public works programs. And of course, thanks to the work of Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a great champion of civil rights during those years, all of which helped create a more inclusive society. And as a result of this, African Americans who traditionally voted Republican, the party of Lincoln, shifted their votes to the Democratic Party. Roughly 75, 80, 90% of African Americans before the New Deal and Roosevelt were voting Republican. The exact same number would vote Democratic after 1933, when he ran for election in 1936. Now, campaigning for re-election, of course, Roosevelt and these programs were very popular among the American people. He was running for office in 1936. Tremendous amounts of mail would come into the White House. For Hoover, it was 5,000 letters a week. For Roosevelt, it was 50,000 a week. And they wrote to both President and Mrs. Roosevelt. And people really felt that they had a friend in the White House. One group that put stood opposed to his reelection was an organization called the American Liberty League, which emerged in the first term of Roosevelt's office, actually by Democrats, founded by Democrats, and we can talk more about that in the question and answer period, who were determined to try to prevent his reelection and said that his use of these programs, basically meant that he was a fascist or a communist or a socialist, you name it, and that the New Deal was essentially an assault on free enterprise and basically unconstitutional. Well, Roosevelt took on the Liberty League, and I should mention that they claimed to be a populist organization, but their membership was only about 125,000, and they basically were supported by the DuPont Corporation and other major business interests by attacking what he called economic royalists. And in a very famous speech he gave in 1936 in the Madison Square Garden, he said this about the economic royalists. It was natural and perhaps human that these privileged princes of these new economic dynasties thirsting for power reached out for control of government itself. They created a new despotism and wrapped it in the robes of legal sanction. Throughout the nation, opportunity was limited by monopoly. Individual initiative was crushed in the cogs of a great machine. The field open for free business was more and more restricted. Private enterprise indeed became too private. It became privileged enterprise, not free enterprise. For too many of us, the political equality we had once won was meaningless in the face of economic inequality. A small group had concentrated into their own hands almost complete control over other people's property, other people's money, other people's property, other people's lives. For too many of us, life was no longer free, liberty no longer real, men could no longer follow the pursuit of happiness. This is the key line here, against economic tyrannies such as this, the American citizen could only appeal to the organized power of government. So this is an incredible fundamental shift in the way the American people thought about their government. And of course, as you know, Roosevelt won the 1936 election in an incredible landslide, almost embarrassing, right? 523 electoral college votes to 8 for Alf Landon. He only took the states of Maine and Vermont. Well, we don't have much time, but we have to deal at least a little bit with the Second World War, because that's going to also have a fundamental impact on American life, but also American leadership in the world. Now, as war leader, I would say that Roosevelt ultimately focused on 3 key objectives. The first was the establishment of the United Nations, or the institutional structures of peace. Second was bringing an end to isolationism. And third, the maintenance of great power cooperation, which above all meant continued engagement with the Soviet Union. Now, Roosevelt faced a real dilemma when the war broke out, because the United States had gone through this period of isolation and neutrality, and a real debate emerged, which really polarized the country. Arthur Schlesinger once told me that it was more intense than the debate over Vietnam, between what we call the America First movement, you may have heard that phrase somewhere recently, and aid to the Allies. And the American Firsters wanted to kind of build up American arms and create a kind of wall around the Western Hemisphere and stay away from Europe and stay away from the British and keep out of the war. Whereas the group that favored aid to the Allies was all in favor of trying to continue or to provide aid to Great Britain and France as they struggled against Nazism. As I said, this sentiment has its roots in the neutrality laws of the 30s, and I won't go into details about that, but the key thing to keep in mind is that Roosevelt would ultimately get an amendment to the neutrality law that was passed in 1939, in November 39, which lifted the arms embargo, so now the United States could provide weapons to the Allies, but did so on a cash and carry basis. So they actually had to pay in cash and carry these items on their own ships. Well, as you know, the war continues. France would fall, then we have the Battle of Britain, and then ultimately the London Blitz. And on the 10th of December, 1940, Roosevelt received a letter from Winston Churchill that said the British Empire was broke. And they literally had spent all the money they could on trying to finance the war. And if they didn't get help from the United States, they were not going to be able to continue. So Roosevelt, has a gift for language. And many Americans were seeing scenes like this in the newspapers and on newsreels. And he gave one of his press conferences, 2 a week for 12 years, 978 press conferences in total throughout his tenure as president. And he said, when you think about it, Britain's defense is our defense. And if you're living in a neighborhood and your neighbor's house is on fire and he comes over and wants to borrow a garden hose, you're going to give him the hose. You're not going to say, are you going to pay for it? Or, you're just going to give him the hose. And he said, in the same way, we need to provide these weapons for the British because they are in desperate need. And then a couple of weeks later, he gave one of his famous fireside chats. And in that wonderful voice of his, he said that the United States must become the arsenal of democracy. I mean, what a phrase. We must become the great arsenal of democracy, which really resonated. And this was the beginning of what would ultimately become the Lend-Lease program in a few months' time, where the United States and the president would have the discretion to provide weapons and all kinds of materials, including food and steel and other commodities, to any nation in the world that he deemed vital to the defense of the United States. And of course, this was aimed particularly at the British, but later on the Russians and so forth. Well, on January 6, 1941, he gave his State of the Union speech. And in that speech, like most State of the Union speeches, Roosevelt had to ask the US Congress for support. They're going to need an appropriation to support Lend-Lease. And ultimately, the American taxpayer is going to have to help pay for this. And near the end of the speech, he asked a hypothetical question. Why should we do this? And this is where he gave, again, what is sometimes referred to as a speech, but it's actually part of this longer address. He said, in future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world funded on 4 fundamental freedoms. And I'll do the voice because Niels asked me to, but in his voice, it would be, the first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world, right? Freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. My favorite, the second, to worship God. No, the freedom, every person to worship God in his own way, everywhere in the world. Freedom of worship everywhere. Now, we're used to that in the United States. We have a constitution that talks about freedom of speech and freedom of worship. But then he said, the third is freedom from want, freedom from destitution, from poverty, everywhere in the world. And the fourth is freedom from fear, so that no nation might fear an act of physical aggression by any neighbor, anywhere in the world. Well, this is a huge expansion of US foreign policy, not just freedom of speech and expression or freedom of worship, but freedom from want and so forth. And these ideas were expanded some months later at the Atlantic Charter meeting with Winston Churchill, where among other things it called securing for all, improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. Sounds familiar, right? The Atlantic Charter also made reference to a post-war security organization, which is widely viewed as the beginning of the United Nations. Then, of course, we know that Pearl Harbor was attacked, and then we know that Winston Churchill invited himself to the White House on his own, and he showed up. Here they are at a press conference. This is a typical scene, this is a Roosevelt press conference. Can you imagine today's president sitting at his desk, having the reporters sit there and fire questions at him right, left, and center? Twice a week for 12 years. And in the course of this meeting, they decided they needed to bring all the nations of the world together who were willing to pledge themselves to defeating the Axis. So not a declaration of war, but doing what they could. And they needed a name for it. And the name actually came to Roosevelt in the middle of the night. He wheeled himself into Churchill's bedroom after Churchill had taken a bath, and he was completely naked. And Roosevelt excused himself, and then Churchill said, "It's all right, Mr. President. As you can see, His Majesty's Prime Minister has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." And that's a true story. And they called it the United Nations, Declaration by United Nations. And the original draft had the British dominions underneath Great Britain. You can see at the top, it's the United States, China, the Union of Soviet Social Republics, United Kingdom, Great Britain, Northern Ireland, then Canada, New Zealand, and so forth. And Roosevelt ultimately took out a pen and said, no, 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 put the dominions in alphabetical order. Very, very interesting. So Roosevelt's, again, going back to what I said earlier, you know, how are we going to set the world on the path to peace? He was always thinking about isolationism. And he said once to Harry Hopkins, anyone who thinks isolation is dead in this country is crazy. As soon as this war is over, it may be stronger than ever. So even in the wake of Pearl Harbor, he was still very worried about that. And so how is he going to convince the American people to embrace, you know, freedom from want, freedom from fear everywhere in the world? And of course, the answer was to go on the radio. And he gave, in February of 1942, one of his most famous fireside chats. And believe it or not, he asked the American people to go out and buy maps. You know, there's no television. And he went on the radio and he said, now take out your maps. And so they did. And most Americans are used to looking at the world like this. And Roosevelt said, World War II is a new kind of war, not only in its technology, but also in its geography. It is warfare on every island, every continent, every island, every sea, and most importantly, every air lane in the world. And as I said, most Americans are used to seeing the world like this, right? Polar projection map, the United States is well protected by these two great oceans, but Roosevelt had printed maps like this, a polar projection map, where you see that the United States and North America is actually not that far from the Eurasian continent. He also had maps printed like this in the press, which showed that with air power, actually the war was not very far away from us. And it's perhaps not surprising then that the symbol for the United Nations is a polar projection map. Now, the other thing, just quickly, and I'll wrap up, Roosevelt had to, of course, maintain great power cooperation. He's looking very pleased with himself, as you can see here, with Churchill and Stalin. And on Churchill's birthday, he pulled out a little piece of paper and he drew this diagram of the United Nations. I don't know how well you can see it, but on the left, it's the 40 UN, that's the General Assembly. Look at this underneath. This is in his own hand. He kept this. ILO, International Labor Organization, Health, World Health Program, Agriculture, Food, World Food Program. That's, you know, that's the ECOSOC chamber in the United Nations. Center, the Executive Office, Secretary General's office, and then on the far right, of course, the four policemen, the Security Council. So he also worked to create the institutional structures of peace, and of course, this would include not only the United Nations, but the World Bank, the IMF, and so forth and so on, all of which sort of stands at the day today as the root of the international system of rules-based economics and security that we rest on, and that has been with us ever since the end of 1945. Let me close with this. This is the only picture I could find with Churchill and with Roosevelt wearing a academic gown. I think it's very fitting to address these questions here at an institution dedicated to higher learning. For as Franklin Roosevelt observed in a statement he issued to mark the start of American Education Week on September 27, 1938, a year before the outbreak of the war, education plays a key role in the preservation and promotion of democracy. What's more, FDR couched his remarks in language that addresses the very topic we have set out to explore today, as a struggle between two rival political systems, between democracy and autocracy. The one represents government by freedom of choice exercised by the individual citizens, FDR said. Individual freedom and initiative are made in the other system, opposing system, individual freedom and initiative are made subordinate to the totalitarian state. In this conflict, he went on, the part which education plays in each role, in each ideology, is crucial. As for democracy, FDR insisted that it cannot succeed unless those who express their choice are prepared to choose wisely. As such, he said, the real safeguard of democracy is education. Given that no system of government gives so much to the individual or exacts so much as democracy, he went on, it follows that the perpetuity of those institutions upon which our freedom and security rest is largely dependent on the nation's educational system. To prepare each citizen to choose wisely and to enable him to choose freely are the paramount functions of the schools in a democracy. I couldn't agree more, and I hope that the proceedings we are about to embark on over the next couple of days will help us gain a deeper understanding of the challenges we face today. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hello, 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 hello. Works? Yes. All right. All right. I'm not going to do voices, but I might hold on really tight here like FDR. So I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker today, someone who is truly at the heart of American political analysis and journalism, E.J. Dionne. E.J. is a well-known columnist for the Washington Post, and someone who, as the New York Times put it, has spent a career searching for common ground among opposing groups in the hope that it can become the foundation of a politics of consensus. Well, that sounds like a pretty good headline for this seminar in these days, I think. Let me just add that E.J. Dionne wears many other hats. He is a university professor at Georgetown. He's a visiting professor at Harvard and a senior fellow at Brookings Institution. If you've ever tuned into NPR or MSNBC for political commentary, chances are you might have heard his insights. He's also written several books and edited many more, covering topics from Barack Obama's speeches to the state of conservatism in America. His latest book, Code Red, is a call to action for those who want to see a united front in politics. But it was actually the title of an earlier book that caught my eye. It's called One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported. Now, I have to say, if you change deported to Danish, this book could also serve as a guide for Danish students and professors, because I think we've all felt a little bit perplexed, disillusioned, and desperate at times watching American politics unfold. But to be honest, we can't get enough. And that's why we're happy to have someone like E.J. Dionne here today to share his wealth of knowledge about the political landscape of America. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming E.J. Dionne.
All right, trying to say something?
Hello.
Oh, that's,
Yeah.
yeah, that works.
I'm fairly loud. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Oh, there you are. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. It is such a joy, and thank you all for coming out, even if many of you were required to do so by your program, but I'm grateful that you're here. It's a real joy and honor to be here at the University of Southern Denmark. I love being at a university that lifts up playfulness along with curiosity and excellence. It gives them equal play. And I'm grateful the Vice Chancellor is here because I want to come back and create a new office of playfulness and run it because I think that would be a lot of fun, but it's a great idea. And I'm also so grateful to have an opportunity I wanted to have for a very long time, which is to visit the country that so many social scientists tell us is the happiest place in the world. And I have to say that in my first day here, the kindness I've been shown by everyone I've encountered, the beauty I've witnessed, and the exceptional efficiency of your public services makes clear that those social scientists are right. And the smiles I see on your faces are part of the witness to that. I know I am not here on my own merits, but because of the kindness of my friends, David and Niels, and also because people here and all over the globe feel that they have a vital interest in the next 5 weeks. It's not even quite 5 weeks anymore of what's happening in the United States. I know many are actually terrified about what voters in my beloved country might do, or perhaps more accurately, what the outcome if in our rickety electoral college system might produce. We usually exaggerate the importance of elections. It's very common for politicians to say, this is the most important election in our history, because they want you all, they want all of us to vote. I actually think that this is the most consequential election in 164 years. And that would bring you back to 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected president of the United States. I think the paths, the divergent paths here are as wide as they've ever been. And I just hope someday soon we produce an election where our friends don't have to be quite so worried or even terrified. Since I resigned my membership in the Union of Election Predictors at midnight in November of 2016 on election day, I have little faith in my own predictions, or for that matter, anyone else's. I can paint plausible scenarios of a Trump victory and equally plausible scenarios that Kamala Harris could win by more than anyone currently expects. And I'll be glad to talk about that, and I'll get to some of that here. More helpful than predictions, I think, are a look at the forces that are at work in our elections that bear a great deal of similarity to what is going on in Europe. And I want to talk about that. I'd like to first build on what David just said about the New Deal and reflect a bit on Joe Biden's presidency. And then I will move to the election. The slides, I won't get to the slides for a little bit, but I've sort of tried to lay out what I think is going on from numbers that everyone can see. I should say that my view is shaped in part by the fact that I am writing a book with my friend, the intellectual historian James Kloppenberg, A History of Social Democracy. Please pray for me. Writing a history of social democracy, when you think of all the countries that it involves, some days I wonder, why did we decide to do this? But it's helped me learn much more about Danish politics, actually. We have, like as David suggested, we think that progressive politics, the New Dealism that David described, is fundamentally, although incompletely, social democratic in the United States. And it's also the product of a dialogue, over a century of dialogue among American progressives, European social democrats, socialists, labor, left liberal parties, and we would now add green parties. I think we forget that this kind of dialogue among progressive forces goes all the way back to the late 19th century and has been ongoing for a long period of time. We argue in our book that the size of the social insurance state in the US was constrained by divisions around race and ethnicity and immigration, difficulties European social democrats have been grappling with for the last quarter century. We could talk more about that, but let's jump straight to the present. And I want to just say a few words about the presidency of Joe Biden. Joe Biden does not describe himself as a social democrat, but he has governed like one. If Biden's defeat of Trump made, in my view, the world safer for democracy generally, his approach to governing gave heart to those who promote social democratic values. As with the victory of New Zealand's former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, just a few weeks before the U.S. voted, Biden's election pointed to a thirst in Democratic electorates for competence in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and for competence in general. A new popular appreciation of the rigors of governing was good news for all Democratic parties confronting forces that thrive on cultural division, symbolic politics, and demagogic efforts to marginalize ethnic, racial, or religious minorities. And in keeping with social democracy's commitments to practical action, Biden's program focused on what pollsters in the United States like to call kitchen table issues, the kind of problems that people discuss at breakfast or lunch or dinner over their kitchen table. His economic rescue package lifted the incomes of the lowest earning fifth of the income distribution by 20%, but it also won broad support because he was attentive to the struggles of middle-income Americans. Republicans challenged Biden's broad definition of the word infrastructure, which is usually in the United States used to refer to roads and bridges and transit, and his expansion to cover child care and elder care programs, and said that they did not fit into the traditional definitions of the word. But in both cases, Biden stressed the job-creating, income-generating aspects of his initiatives, and they happen to be popular with people of all sorts of political views. His climate proposals he touted for their job-creating potential, pushing back against those who long cast action against climate change as a drag on the economy. Biden insisted it would be the opposite. In the end, what Biden and Democratic Congresses enacted in 2021 and 2022 was far less expansive than the president hoped for. Talk of Biden as a new FDR, and there was a lot of that in the first year, receded some. But the comparison of with FDR remains instructive. As in the 1930s, in the 2020s, it may take an American president to defend and adapt progressive and social democratic ideas at a time when they face serious challenges in their European home. And again, as in the 1930s, it may take broad and sometimes ungainly sorts of coalitions, which is what the Democratic Party is, to show how progressives in other countries can construct workable alliances for their own purposes. Biden's green investments passed through Congress in 2022, I think, are an especially powerful example of the influence of climate-driven industrial policy. In the fall of that year, a British Labour Party leader and now Prime Minister Keir Starmer headed down a similar path. He promised to turn the UK into a growth superpower through Labour's Green Prosperity program, even if he has scaled it back since in the face of budget problems. Australia's Labour Party Prime Minister Anthony Albanese introduced legislation to establish a $10 billion US dollars fund to facilitate flow of finance into the green energy sector. And Biden's green program, as you know, has set off a broad debate within the European Union over how to respond to an American initiative that was bolder in its climate interventionism than anything on offer here. And that was really remarkable because it is the EU, it is your countries that have historically been more sympathetic to government-led economic partnerships. It's far too early to know how history will judge Biden's presidency. And of course, a lot will depend on what happens in our coming elections. But I think that we have seen that Biden has shown, and along with a number of other leaders, have shown that ideas rooted in progressive and social democratic tradition married to a newer ecological movement are in fact adaptable to new circumstances, new problems, and changing electorates. I think that Biden is important in another way. His administration signaled a decisive shift from the neoliberal aspects of a long era that ran from Reagan and Thatcher to Clinton and Blair. And by the way, I don't think Reagan and Thatcher and Clinton and Blair are exactly the same thing, but I think the economic thinking that dominated that whole period was in common. They had that in common. And this revisionism about neoliberalism has not just affected the traditional left, but the center and the center left as well. Biden was a moderately progressive senator who had supported moves toward freer trade and deregulation in the Clinton years. But like many on the center left, he came to see the costs of globalization, especially to the poorly paid, the problems with deregulation, particularly as we saw in the crash of 2008 in the financial markets, the virtues of industrial policy to spur growth, promote new technology, and as I said, to fight climate change, and the economic advantages of a more egalitarian economy growing, as he put it, over and over again, from the bottom up and the middle out. If Keynesian economics came under attack from the 1970s to the 1990s, we have recently witnessed a backlash against neoliberal ideas and classical economics that began with the economic crash. Biden absorbed this swing and embodied it in his policies. So you might ask, if Biden was so great, if Bidenomics actually worked extremely well, just look at the US growth, inflation, and unemployment rates, why is Biden still not popular? And why did he have to drop out of the presidential race? There are many partial explanations and one big one. The legislative messiness around the package of Biden's programs and the fact that only parts of it became law is a piece of this puzzle. The enduring parts were long-term investments whose impact will be felt only over time. Specific temporary programs that voters could notice and feel immediately, for example, stimulus checks during the COVID period, or the child tax credit, which is essentially an American version of the European child allowance, these expired during Biden's terms. Congress did not renew them. More important was the inflation that followed the end of the pandemic, which Republicans and a rather large part of the economics profession blamed on the large stimulus program that passed shortly after Biden was elected. In fact, that stimulus is a central reason why the U.S. avoided high unemployment, and it now appears that inflation was more the product of post-pandemic conditions, including supply chain difficulties, than it was the fruit of the stimulus. But the critique stuck, and even with inflation down now to 2.2%, Biden still gets the blame. There is still, the problem with inflation going down is it doesn't mean prices go down. It just means they stop rising faster. And a lot of people were frustrated by prices in very particular areas that hit close to home, including groceries. Gas was up and down, and housing, which is now a problem, I think, across the wealthy world. But the big problem for Joe Biden is the number 81. Anybody know why I refer to the number 81? Oh, come on, somebody can make a guess. His age. His age, thank you. Yeah, his age. Even before his catastrophic debate performance on June 27th, majorities, roughly 6 in 10 Americans, including a very substantial minority of Democrats, thought he was too old to seek a second term. That debate really settled the question, and Democratic leaders, many of them operating behind the scenes out of respect for Biden, but many of them also openly, decided that his renomination would be a catastrophe for all Democrats on the ballot and not just simply for him. And so reluctantly, a little less than a month after that debate, he dropped out on July 21st. And Kamala Harris took over and proved to be a better politician than many, many Democrats thought, although importantly, not those who watched her rise in California, who were much less surprised at the kind of candidate she proved to be. But I also think her strength reflected the fact that there is something very close to, and we'll see how big it is in 4 weeks, there is something very close to an anti-Trump majority in the country, in the electorate, that Biden's age was holding down. And so this is where I want to turn to the numbers to give you a sense of what is going on now in the United States. Now, can you show me how to move these? That's okay. Yeah. So the first slide you'll see just shows, note that number at the top with Joe Biden running behind Donald Trump was that poll was taken before the debate. So these numbers do not reflect the debate, his problems afterward. He was having this problem now. July 21st, the polling averages stood at Trump with a roughly 3-point lead over Joe Biden. The poll averages as of Wednesday of this week, I tried to be very current for this crowd, show Harris ahead by 2 points. So that is a substantial shift. Another way to look at it is to think about the double haters. You never want an election in which the term double haters becomes a popular term. As some of you know who are real American political junkies, double haters referred to voters who really, really, really didn't like Donald Trump, but also really didn't like Joe Biden. There were people who told pollsters they disapproved of them. Double haters in that earlier survey that's here constituted 17% of the electorate. And if you note in that particular poll, these were all Monmouth polls, Trump was ahead of Biden by 3 points, with 17% disliking both. Harris jumps in the race, and look what happens to two numbers. That's why I drew those little arrows. The number of double haters was cut in more than half, goes down from 17% to 8%. And it was always the case that double haters seemed to lean more toward Biden if you really, really press them. Harris's vote went up at almost exactly the same number as the double haters went down. So I think there was something kind of natural sitting in the electorate that Harris, coming up as a new candidate against Trump, took advantage of. I want to go through the fundamentals of this election. This is a survey from The Economist, September 29 to October 1. A very important fact of this election is a gender gap. And we've had a lot of gender gaps in American politics since really 1980 is when gender gaps started showing up. It is looking particularly large this year. I've seen polls that show it even larger than this one. Note that Trump is ahead of Harris by 4 points among men, but Harris is ahead of Trump by 10 points among women. And if Harris wins, women will be a central part of her coalition. White voters are for Trump by about 11 points. Black voters are strongly for Harris. And Latino voters are very much in play. There is a lot of movement going on among Latino voters in the United States. That's a very diverse group of voters. Latinos come from Puerto Rico and from Mexico and from Cuba and from Venezuela. So it's a very diverse group with different politics. There are also differences between Catholic and evangelical Latinos. There are differences by region. But the Republican vote has been going back up among Latinos, and that is a real challenge for Kamala Harris, even though she is still winning them, but that's a smaller margin than Democrats have enjoyed in recent elections. In the US, as in a lot of other places, there is a lot of conversation about the great education divide in our electorate. And it used to be historically that the Democrats did better among, in the New Deal period and after, Democrats did better among those with a less formal education because Democrats were broadly seen, generally seen as a party of the working class, much like social democratic parties. Now this is inverted. Democrats have become the party of the college, university educated, which again is something that's happened to social democratic parties around Europe, so that among white voters without a college degree, that is one of Trump's strongest groups in the electorate. And Trump actually once said, "I love the poorly educated." Whites with college degrees are voting for Harris. Black voters, as you can see there in both groups, are for Harris. But even in a group where she has a big advantage, she does better among those with college degrees. And the same applies with Latinos. Religion is a very important factor in the way Americans vote, particularly the importance of the Christian evangelical movement. And you'll see here that white evangelicals are a very, very strong group for Donald Trump. But jump over to the other side to Black Protestants. Black Americans are, but judged by all of the numbers, also very religious. And the Black church has been important in the Black community since the end of slavery. It was actually important. There were slave churches. And the church for Black Americans provided a ground for independent social action in a situation of searing oppression. If you want an analogy, I've thought the role of the Catholic Church in Poland under communism is somewhat similar to the role of the Black church in the years of segregation and Jim Crow. It was a kind of safe space, and it remains important. Catholics are, again, a very diverse group, but they're also a swing group in American politics. Jews remain overwhelmingly for Harris. There weren't enough Muslim Americans that appeared in this survey. But if you talk about conflicts over the Middle East, roughly 2/3 of American Jews and roughly 2/3 of American Muslims are Democrats. So this controversy, this conflict is very important inside the Democratic Party right now. Where has Harris improved? The people in this room are very key to what has happened to Harris, or people like you back home, because her gains among young voters have been really staggering. Look at Biden at 41%. I think my own view is this estimate is probably a little low for Biden, but I wanted consistent polls. The Democratic vote there goes up by 16 points, but it's not just that the vote went up. There are surveys that show that enthusiasm levels among young people rose by something like 16 points in many of the surveys. That young people, many of whom were going to vote for Biden but had no energy in it, which meant that some of them wouldn't go to the polls. Since Harris has become the candidate, they have shown great enthusiasm. They've volunteered in the campaign. That is a key group. Black voters have increased their support for the Democratic candidate, and women have increased their support. Let's see, wait, am I going? Oh, I'm going backwards. Yeah, here we go. The groups that are about the same are Latino voters, independents, and voters age 65. I just put an asterisk next to that, voters over at 65 and over. There are some signs that Harris has been weakening a little bit relative to Biden in that group. And that's going to be, the need to at least stay with Biden's numbers is going to be very important to Harris in this election. What issues matter? It's very clear that preserving abortion rights, reproductive rights, is one of the most powerful issues pushing people to Democrats, a 54 to 29 advantage for Harris over Trump. Immigration is, I'm skipping one here. Immigration is Trump's most powerful issue. It's one reason why Trump and J.D. Vance, his running mate, no matter what the issue is, we'll bring it back to immigration. In the debate on Monday, J.D. Vance blamed the housing problem on immigration. And if you want to know why, you just look at these numbers. But the economy also is an issue that still is helping Republicans despite the economic improvement. Harris has cut Trump's advantage on the economy some since she became the candidate. But that discontent over over inflation is very sticky, and that remains a problem. And the voters are split on who would serve best as commander-in-chief, at least in this survey. The biggest advantage for Trump and the problem for Harris is, despite the country being in remarkably good shape, there's still a sour mood. I believe some of that is still the backwash of the pandemic. I think that's part of it. I think part of it is there are still significant numbers of people who, even if the economy is booming, are not as well off as they were. There are great regional economic disparities in the country, as well as disparities of race and class. But Biden's approval rating, again, this one, I've seen them higher. There was a period where as soon as Biden dropped out, his approval rating climbed, which I think were some people saying, yeah, you haven't been that bad a president, but I'm glad you dropped out. But this is a problem for Harris. And 61% think the country is on the wrong track. That number's improved a little bit with the good economic news, but that's not a good news for someone who is running as part of the incumbent administration. I just want to just put three sort of longer term trends on the table for you to think about. As many of you know, the Supreme Court of the United States radically overturned abortion law in the United States a couple of years ago in a decision called the Dobbs decision. And what this is, the abortion under the earlier Roe v. Wade ruling was broadly legal around the country. This threw the abortion issue back to the states. And the states are now very divided. Depending on where you live, abortion law can be quite radically different. Just as there was a backlash among opponents of abortion against the original Supreme Court decision in 1973, there has been an enormous backlash among supporters of abortion rights since the Dobbs decision. Abortion before the Dobbs decision tended to be an issue that helped conservatives because most people who are progressive and for abortion rights figured they were safe because the court would keep them, Roe v. Wade intact. When that was overthrown, abortion is now, as you saw, a voting issue for Democrats. And just look at that little blue line there opening up. On the dark blue line are people who say abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And that has climbed since Dobbs. And the chart on the right shows that one of the reasons, if you've been following the election, that Mr. Trump has had about 5 or 6 or 7 positions on abortion since the campaign began is that it really splits the Republican Party. 41% of voters who are Republican or lean Republican think abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And so we're going to be seeing the impact of this in this election, and I think going forward. This chart, I love this map. I think one of the big changes that's going on in politics all over the world, in Europe as well as the United States, is the increasing concentration of the broadly progressive vote in big metro areas, cities and the areas around them, and the move of small town and rural areas to the right. You see that in the voting in France, in the Le Pen Macron election. You've seen that up in Sweden in that way. This sort of big metropolitan area versus the countryside is a very big split. And this is just a very good indicator of that. That red is the Republican color. It's a very odd thing that red is the Republican color, since you would think that is the party of social democrats and socialists. But I am told that there was a fear when they started doing maps on the TV. There was fear that they would look McCarthyite if they made the Democrats red, because it would say they are like communists. And so they flipped them. And so the Democrats are blue and the Republicans are red. The left side, in 1996, Bill Clinton won for Democrat, 49.2% of the vote. 2020, Joe Biden won 51.3% of the vote. Yet Joe Biden, with slightly more than Clinton, only carried 535 out of about 3,000 counties in the United States. Counties are small units of government. Bill Clinton, on the other hand, carried 1,500 counties. Look at the changes in the Midwest. Look at that line from Minnesota all the way down to Louisiana, if you know your American geography. A lot of blue in the Clinton years, a whole lot of red in the 2020 election. I think that the Clinton's number may be slightly elevated because there was a third party candidate, but that's still, I think, a fair representation of an enormous swing that you should think about as you study us, but also I think as you study European politics. The two big factors that I mentioned, the importance of white evangelicals and the importance of the college, non-college split, creates some interesting openings for political candidates right now. The college educated, more Democratic, non-college educated, more Republican. The other big split is among whites, white evangelicals and whites who are not evangelical, which includes every other kind of religion and the increasing number of Americans who are secular, who do not connect with religious institutions. We are, in this respect, becoming somewhat more European in the United States over the last 20 years. So, interesting book for those of you interested in this is called Secular Surge by a scholar called David Campbell. But the non-evangelicals include all those groups, secular and religious, but who just aren't evangelical. What's really interesting are the numbers crosswise. Not surprising that those who are college educated and non-evangelical gave only 28% of the vote to Trump. Not surprising that the non-college evangelicals gave 84% of their votes to Trump. But look the other way. Among evangelicals, the percentage, an overwhelmingly Trump group, the percentage among the college educated back in 2020 in the exit polls was only 63%. I think that is a group that is going to be cross-pressured and up for grabs. Similarly, among non-college voters, it really made a difference in the evangelical vote. If you were not college educated, but also not an evangelical, you were also much more likely to vote Democratic. So I think that cross pressure is a very important thing to think about when you're thinking about American politics. And lastly, I wanted to be completely up to date. So I added a slide on the debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz this week. There are several polls. I picked the CNN one. It was basically a tie. It appears that this group is slightly more Democratic. It looks like more Democrats watched the debate slightly than Republicans did. What's fascinating is that both of them saw their favorable rating go up. They had this very friendly, warm, non-polarized debate. which is quite remarkable given what's at stake in the election. There is a term, some of you who really are deep into American culture know, it's Minnesota nice, that people in Minnesota are famous for being really nice. My own view is that tactically, Tim Walz was too Minnesota nice to J.D. Vance that night. And he basically, I think, allowed him to substantially improve his standing. Look, before the debate, look at his favorable, unfavorable rating. Only 30% had a favorable view of J.D. Vance. It went up to 41 after the debate. Walz's favorable rating also went up. So a lot of people like the niceness on stage. Personally, I think as a political matter, Vance might have served the Democrats better by being a little tougher, but we'll see what happens. And vice presidential debates very rarely have any effect on the final outcome, but it's an interesting thing. So I want to close. So that is my lesson from the numbers. I hope you like numbers. I find, especially when I give talks to folks for whom English is a second language, although in this country you guys are brilliant at languages, that numbers help people through where they might wonder, perhaps because of the quality of the speaker, what the heck was that guy really saying? The numbers make it clear. So where are we going? If Harris wins, she has already signaled that she will move to complete, again, what I've called the most social democratic parts of the Biden program, particularly relating to the care economy, child care, care for the elderly, family leave, which is very weak in the United States, and further expansions of the healthcare gains under Obama. She has married this to a somewhat more business-friendly approach in the campaign, although she is still, her tax program is still more egalitarian than the status quo. While her foreign policy views are not fully known, she has operated squarely within the pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine, pro-democracy space carved out by Biden. It's striking that while Republican elected officials have been reluctant to break ranks and endorse Harris, a very large number of Republicans who are not in office, particularly the strong foreign policy voices in the Republican Party, are have openly endorsed Harris. As for Trump victory, which is still very possible, I will say simply and diplomatically that a second Trump term will be more challenging and difficult than the first. And I'll be happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. Who will decide? First, core Democrats, particularly among the young and also in the Black and Latino communities. The issue there is not who they'll vote for, it's if they will turn out to vote. And she needs very substantial turnouts there. Secondly, suburban moderates and even moderately conservative voters, especially women, who can't stomach Trump, support reproductive rights, but may still not be fully sold on Harris. There are a small number of undecided voters, but I think this group is among them. And lastly, a share of working class voters who, particularly among whites, have been drawn to Trump. Biden shaved Democratic losses among these voters. Harris needs to do the same. And it's striking that she and Tim Walz are spending a lot of time in Republican areas going after this vote, knowing that if you lose an area 65-35, and instead of 80-20, those little gains, even in places you lose, can become very important in the final outcome. Winston Churchill is said to have, you got double Churchill references today. Winston Churchill is said to have observed that Americans always do the right thing after first exhausting all of the other possibilities. And I think we have spent a lot of time in recent years exhausting all of those other possibilities. The election hangs on whether a majority is itself exhausted and ready to move on. Harris's campaign is premised on the idea of an exhausted majority that wants to move on, and there's a lot of evidence that this is happening. But as I said, My membership in the Prognosticators Union has lapsed, so I will leave it there, except to say that I have a long addiction to betting on hope. Thank you all so very much. Thank you.
Please remember we're going to do the Q&A right now. I can get this one.
So I hope you will ask us deeply challenging questions. And if you ask a lot of questions, we can skip the hard ones and answer the easy ones.
Hello. Okay, it's working. All right. Maybe two. We'll try. Oh, God, success. Excellent. There you go.
Wait, do you need a mic?
I'm good.
Okay, sorry about the technical hiccup a little bit earlier. Yeah, we'll try this one. Excellent, thank you. And sorry to the people on Zoom for the echo in the beginning. However, if you do need to hear an echo of a voice, might have the soothing voice of David. So we have time for a little bit of Q&A. So if you have any questions from the room, our wonderful student aides will jump around with a microphone, and you can ask either EJ Dionne or David Woolner. For the people on Zoom, please enter in the Q&A.
Is that gentleman back there? And that gentleman over there.
It's working, yeah. I remember you, David, in the fall last year, you said that today's world is a Roosevelt world. What do you think Roosevelt would do to make sure that his so-called world restore and prevail? I think especially about the UN. Yeah, you see the Security Council, the veto idea. Obviously, theoretically, a great idea, but right now, yeah, you also see the challenges with it.
Well, thank you for the question, and I do remember you. Well, I used to say, you know, Franklin Roosevelt built the house we all live in. We might move the furniture around or you know, remodel the house, but we wouldn't tear it down, even among Republicans, you know, getting rid of things like Social Security and so forth. But I think this election, as EJ has said, is the most consequential because the norms have kind of gone out the window. And we face unbelievable challenges. Roosevelt obviously was a politician who had to deal with the reality. So we have the flaws in the United Nations and the Security Council with the veto system and so forth. He needed that veto, by the way, just as much to get American support as he did to get the Soviet support. But I think, you know, I always remember the line that EJ, last time we spoke, I quoted from Roosevelt in the same 1936 speech, which sounds pretty strong. He said, "Never in the history of this republic has a group of people been more united in their hatred for me, and I welcome their hatred. Let it be said of my first administration, they met their match. Let it be said of my second administration, they met their master." So I think he would probably take on Trump sort of full war, I would think. But we are in a very unusual time.
Yeah, it's very hard to, in a way, to when you think about the 30s and now, there are some similarities that really jump out at you, particularly the rise of authoritarian politics in many countries and challenges to democracy. And challenges to democracy, not only in the obvious way, but you know, there is some polling that shows, for example, that young people around Europe are somewhat less committed to democracy than young people were a decade or two ago because they perceive failures of government, and most of their governments are democratic. So they are, it doesn't mean that you are anti-democratic, young people, but it does, there is some slippage there. On the other hand, I think the array of forces in the world is different. The durability of the long period of, you know, this sort of experiment in a sort of mildly but significantly egalitarian liberal democratic order with a kind of strong dose of Christian or social democracy Europe in the 30s did not have that long history. So that when you look at the authoritarians in the basically, broadly speaking, the West, they are fighting against a much longer period of fairly durable regime. And so it's not exactly the same. It's so interesting to think about what would a politician like Roosevelt do in circumstances like this. And it's hard to say because he didn't live in circumstances like this. You couldn't imagine our current media system allowing Roosevelt to go through an entire administration. Those pictures David shown were not shown to the American people at the time. They didn't know. I mean, they sort of knew Roosevelt had this, was in a wheelchair, but they didn't see him that way. And we couldn't imagine a media system treating Roosevelt the way that way now. It would be very different.
The one other thing that I should mention is remember that the parties are very different. I mean, we are living in an incredibly polarized time, even though there was hatred against Roosevelt and a conservative cadre against him. Many of his supporters were Republicans. And so the political makeup of the parties was actually much healthier. Up until fairly recently, there were liberal Republicans and very conservative Democrats. So issues were fought more on their merit than on, I can't support this because it's a Republican idea, or I can't support this because it's a Democratic idea. So our politicians and our leaders, I mean, going back, even certainly under Obama, what did Mitch McConnell say? Our job is to make him a one-term president. It wasn't about leading. It was all about the political game. So that's a real change.
Let me footnote that in one way, and I think you'll agree with this, this business of the old system being healthier. It is true there were a lot of progressive Republicans, but those conservative Democrats in significant part were segregationist Democrats in the South who were still voting on the basis of the Civil War. And they were on the wrong side of a rather important issue. And so there was a fight in the Democratic Party over civil rights, and advocates of civil rights won. And that is, I think, for our country in the long term, a good thing. Yeah. But it is entirely true that the parties are now much less ideologically diverse. And that has created a problem because we don't have a parliamentary system. And I think that's one of the real challenges in understanding us compared to Europeans, that Kamala Harris might get elected, say, and have maybe a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. This makes it very complicated to govern. And having these cross-party possibilities that you had much more in the past makes it somewhat easier to govern in this non-parliamentary. President Nelson's an expert on the presidency, this non-parliamentary presidential system we have. This gentleman over here. I know.
Let me talk loud. It's okay. Just like talk very sit up. Thank you for two really wonderful talks. I want to talk potentially one thing that wasn't in any discussion so far, which is Donald Trump is a criminal. Donald Trump has been convicted in court in New York, has to pay what, $300 million? I can't tell you a huge amount. He's also been convicted in a civil case that has to pay a huge amount of money to a woman who he raped. Now you would think that in most countries, and also in the United States, that would be enough in itself to disqualify him. So I'm not saying this in a moralistic way, I'm just asking, as political enemies, why do you think this doesn't matter?
Go ahead. I'll let you go first, David.
Well, I mean, there's a long story behind that. I would say there's always been a streak of anti-elitism in the United States. It's sort of, this idea that we need an axe and a shovel and we go off into the wilderness and we can take care of ourselves. There's also been a strong reaction to the sort of politically correct movement. We saw it in the 70s for a while, and it comes and goes. But something about this particular era where, one of the candidates, we all knew, I can't mention his name because my wife won't let me, the guy who starts with T, ripped off the norms completely and unleashed the ability, and actually it's interesting because my wife, who is a person of color, predicted during Obama, because I was like, isn't this great? We had this black president. We're finally beyond civil rights. She said, no, 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 you just watch. And sure enough, you know, I think some of it is a reaction to the Obama presidency. The pictures of him in the Tea Party, dressed in African garb and so forth, his issue about his name, the Hussein name, and then the birther controversy. You know, this particular individual stoked this latent bigotry that's always been a part of the American politic, and somehow it translated into political gain for him. And he has a lot of enablers, unfortunately, including the Speaker of the House, who basically overlook a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I think I grew up in Massachusetts. Now, Massachusetts is a state that actually elected people sitting in jail cells. And there was a very popular but controversial governor named James Michael Curley. And he got elected from he got either elected or reelected from a jail cell. And there were a couple of other politicians too. What Curley and Trump have in common, and Curley might be turning over in his grave at this comparison, Curley was a Democrat, is that they were seen by their supporters as speaking for a group that felt in its way oppressed, pushed back. And the politicians like that who develop a very, very, very strong loyalty with a group that feels this person represents their values, their interests, who they are, against some elite. And you know, a lot of this resentment on the right is against, you know, there is obviously racism and anti-immigration feeling, but there's also opposition to an elite that doesn't understand them in Hollywood and New York and, you know, the universities, all that kind of stuff. So that I think Trump has created this group of supporters. And there's also just, we have a different media system now where people interpret these things differently depending on what media they consume and what political views they have. So in the eyes of Trump supporters, these are all trumped up charges by Democratic controlled prosecutors and the like. This is not my view. My view is closer to yours. And I still do find it remarkable that Trump's vote has stuck as high as it has. So I think your question remains a good one. I'm trying to give some structural explanations for why I think this has happened. And then the last is Republican politicians could have said at a certain point enough. If Republicans, Mitch McConnell really, really doesn't like Donald Trump. He gave a speech after voting against impeachment, saying that he will be taken care of by the courts. And it was really, really critical. Had 10 more Republicans voted for the impeachment, he would have been barred from the presidency. Because Trump voters are so important in Republican primaries, Republican politicians who might in their quiet moments say something like you said, are not willing to say so because they think it would mean death, political death in their own party. And so I think that also contributes to this.
And on top of all that, I remember when the New York Attorney General launched the first indictment, and I had foreboding about that. Because remember, around that time, he was sort of seen as the loser and so forth. And as soon as that indictment hit, he jumped on this victim bandwagon and his support started climbing. So it's not only that they're ignoring it, he's been using it as a tool to gain more support.
Too corrupt. I love American corruption when it happens. Not this one in particular. I like old-fashioned corruption. There's a famous Southern politician who was indicted for something, for bribery, and he went around the state and said, "I may have stole, but I stole for you." And then there was Edward Edwards, the governor of Louisiana, who was a really fascinating figure and an entertaining figure, and he eventually went to the slammer. But he was running against an opponent, he was a Democrat. He was running against a Republican at a time of high unemployment in Louisiana, very bad economy. And he knew that people in the state thought he was a crook. And, you know, he said, look, if my opponent is reelected, there'll be nothing left for me to steal. And when he ran against a Klansman, he was the progressive candidate. And people all over the state put bumper stickers on their car that said, "Vote for the crook. It's important." So we do this sometimes in my dear country.
All right, we have one more quick question and then we need to wrap up.
I was just wondering if you think there's any merit to it. It has struck me that Trump is very good at tapping into sort of the lost cause. You know, whenever he talks about American history, there's a sense of victimization that somehow, you know, not just Charlottesville, but the whole discussion about the Confederate monuments being removed. Recently, he was at Gettysburg and somehow managed to turn, you know, the story of Gettysburg into something that was, wow, so ugly, but also so beautiful. And he's using Civil War references in a way that perhaps taps into something I haven't thought about before. I wonder what you think about that. Whether the South will rise again, you know, make America great again, if there's a thing there going on.
Hey, could I ask one thing? Everybody, I teach and I've noticed who raises hands first. There are no women in the class, this classroom, who've asked a question yet. Is there somebody who does want to join this conversation? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I feel like that I believe in broad representation in the democracy. I just want to know if anybody, okay. All right, going once, going twice, we'll take this great question. Yeah, I think there's some of that going on. I think, since, well, first of all, we've been fighting about race in the United States from the very beginning, from before the beginning of the Republic. That's where the whole 1619 thing came. Whether you take it for 1619 or 1787, or the Civil War, or the rise of Jim Crow, or the Civil Rights Movement. I mean, this argument and struggle has been part of our story for a long time, and it shapes, it's always shaped a significant part, an important part of the American political conversation. The forces that Trump represents are clearly the forces, and I'm not even counting the ultra-right Charlottesville demonstrators, although he couldn't even bring himself to condemn them. But I'm just talking about rank and file conservative whites in the South who don't like pulling down the monuments, who think it's part of heritage, who started shifting away from the Democratic Party when the Civil Rights Bills were passed in 1964. I mean, this is a very long struggle. And so I think Trump is very clearly on one side of that struggle. And you mentioned the lost cause, by the way, for those of you who aren't deep in the weeds of American history. When the South lost the Civil War, they almost won the battle over the meaning of the Civil War. It was called, it became a cult of the lost cause among people who revered the Confederacy. There's groups like Daughters of the Confederacy and all that kind of stuff. And so I think Trump used the election of 2020 to create his own lost cause. And I thought a lot about the politics of lost cause when Trump was doing that, because he was, even though he lost the election and the South lost the Civil War, he was saying that we were robbed. We need to stand up to these forces who are against us. And I don't know if he consciously imitated the lost cause in doing that, but I think it functionally served the same purpose lost cause rhetoric served white white racist Southerners or white conservative Southerners. I don't want to, they're not all racist. I don't like accusing whole groups of being racist, but there was clearly real deep racism in the South in the Jim Crow period. And there's still this sense that if you don't revere this past, you are, somehow you're somehow breaking with the authenticity of American history, something like that, which overlooks the fact these monuments were not the products of the Civil War. They were the product of the rise of Jim Crow and segregation. But so I think it's a very rich question that you asked. David, do you have a?
No, I just say it's again, it's part of this anti-elite sentiment in the United States. Busing in the 1970s also had a big impact on the whole issue of race among suburban voters in the United States. And you started seeing the shift in the 70s from working class Democrats shifting to voting Republican, partly because of the sense that they were being told and to do things by their government that they didn't want to do. This kind of thing. Vietnam War also played a role in that. So it's part of the same tradition.
All right, I think we need to wrap up here because we are running a little bit late. We also got a little bit of a late start, but if you would like to see more of E.J. Dionne and David Woolner, then join us tomorrow for the presidential roundtable conversation with Jan Brandel and Niels B. Poulsen.
And if you don't want to see more of us, but want to see a lot of other cool people, you should also come to that roundtable. Thank you all so very much.
Yeah, but please give him a hand, all right?
Thank you.
So we're just going to take 5 minutes to set up for the new webinar with Professor Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins. Thank you to all on Zoom. You can join the next webinar if you would like to. So thank you all, and thank you to student aides for their help. Thank you.
I didn't want to keep questions, but I think about it.
Do you need anything?
This.